New Orleans Saints hire Kellen Moore as head coach. Ladies and gentlemen, the backdrop, Matt Moscona, after further review. Very interested to hear his reaction, how he kind of sees this all going and how he feels about the new direction of the New Orleans Saints. Because remember, a lot of people were saying that no one would come to the Saints. A lot of people were saying Mickey Loomis should be fired, Gale should sell the team, dumpster franchise. They'll end up with Anthony Weaver, Mike Kafka. If they're lucky, maybe Darren Rizzi. They can't do this, they can't do that. They're making a mistake. And lo and behold, a couple days after the Super Bowl, and the Saints are sitting pretty. All right, they can kick their feet up and relax because, in my opinion, they got the best candidate in the pool. So let's go ahead and take a listen, shall we?
Well, it is now officially official. Kellen Moore, officially the 19th head coach in New Orleans Saints history. A horribly kept secret over the past 2 weeks. Saints, as we know, trying to do everything by the books, but everyone knew this was ultimately the end game, barring, as it was said many times,
Yeah, I will say real quick, the Saints, absolute 8D, 10D, 12D chess. I mean, they made every move they made was the right move. Every single thing that they did was the right way to do it. The fact that they held put early on, the fact that they didn't rush to Mike McCarthy or they didn't rush to Darren Rizzi or didn't rush to whoever, the fact that they didn't give in to some of the demands or whatever of some of these other candidates, the fact that they interviewed a wide pool, the fact that they held on when they had the leverage, when they realized, damn, we're the only job left. They said, we're happy to take this thing past the Super Bowl. Everything they did, flying up to Philly, meeting with Kellen Moore, letting him have the week, letting him enjoy the Super Bowl week and prep and all that stuff and not get bogged down in this whole thing. Really nice job from the front office and from anyone that was involved in this.
Some unforeseen roadblock, but here we are. Tuesday afternoon, after reports all morning that it had been done, the New Orleans Saints issued the press release, and Kellen Moore is the new head coach of the New Orleans Saints. We'll start with a reaction to the hire, why I like it, why I don't, what's most important moving forward, all that good stuff. First and foremost, how should we feel about this hire? And not as good as Detroit. I mean, the belle of the ball was big.
Wait, what? Not as good as Detroit? What do you mean? Do you mean Chicago?
Ben Johnson.
Okay. He must mean Chicago.
He was the guy everybody wanted. And he's in Chicago. Left Detroit for Chicago. How do we feel? Not as good as the Jets. The guy you really wanted was Aaron Glenn. He picked the Jets instead of you. You wanted Joe Brady. He decided to stay in Buffalo. You wanted to talk to Cliff Kingsbury. He decided to stay in Washington. So you got far down your list. But
I let him go a little bit there because I wanted to hear the whole thing. I think this is crazy. I mean, I really do. The only reason people have Ben Johnson or Joe Brady ahead of Kellen Moore is because of some fugazi media narrative. Here's the deal. Kellen Moore is more experienced, no pun intended, more experienced. He's younger and more successful than Ben Johnson. If you wanted a defensive head coach, I can understand if you wanted Aaron Glenn, if that's the direction you wanted to go and you feel like you'd rather have a defensive guy or whatever, okay. But if we're talking about the offensive coaches, the coordinators that could have been head coaches, Ben Johnson, Kellen Moore, Joe Brady. I'm not even going to count Cliff Kingsbury because, like Nick Underhill tweeted this week, like that never really was a thing. So to say that Cliff turned us down or whatever is a bit wrong. So I'm not going to include him. Let's just talk about Ben Johnson, Joe Brady, and Kellen Moore. Joe Brady's been the offensive coordinator for a year and a half. Didn't call plays at LSU. Okay. And then we just went over Ben Johnson. You have a 36-year-old offensive coordinator of the Super Bowl champions who has been an offensive coordinator for 3 teams and has had success at all 3 teams since 2019. And you're going to sit there and say that you would rather have Ben Johnson or Joe Brady? Why? Because Stephen A. Smith or somebody on ESPN says Joe Brady's the hype hire, or he's like the exciting hire? Why? So you want the older, less experienced, less successful coordinator. Is that what we're saying? Is that the deal? Am I missing something with why Ben Johnson and Joe Brady are on this pedestal that Kellen Moore is not there? I will say this until I'm blue in the face. If you could go back, reset the entire coaching carousel, I think Kellen Moore is 1 or 2 off the board. I think he is either the first or the second coach hired. I think he is either the number 1 or the number 2 most desired. I think it would be him and Mike Vrabel. I think would be your 2 guys, because Vrabel's differentiator is that he's a culture guy, he's an identity guy, he's a franchise setter, he's done it before, you know he can do it. Moore, Johnson, all those guys, you still have concerns about like what they could be as a head coach as far as like the identity, the culture, all that stuff. But you take Vrabel out, I think after the Super Bowl and after all this played out, no doubt in my mind, Kellen Moore would be higher on the rankings than Ben Johnson or Joe Brady.
But it doesn't mean you can't find a winner. It doesn't mean you can't hit on the hire just because it wasn't your first choice. And the Eagles' playoff run does give Kellen Moore a really significant boost, doesn't it?
Hell yes. That's what I'm saying with this whole Aaron Glenn thing. Like, I was never, like, hey, go get, to say Glenn is your number 1 or whatever. I think for a while, Kellen Moore wasn't even on the board as far as, like, the entirety of the NFL. I think that's where the Saints got lucky, is I think Kellen Moore was kind of in the background. He was kind of like, okay, he's only been in Philadelphia for 1 year, whatever. And then as the playoffs kept going, it was more and more of like, man, maybe we should start looking at Kellen Moore. And at that point, a lot of teams had already made their decisions, right? Like all these other teams had already jumped at Liam Cohen or Aaron Glenn or Ben Johnson or Pete Carroll or whatever, and they were all kind of stuck. And just how luck had it, the Saints were able to sit back, chill, not overreact, and the best coach fell to him.
I mean, we were not talking about Kellen Moore at all before Championship Sunday.
We mentioned Kellen Moore a few times, but like I said, he was always there because he's a young offensive coordinator who's wanted to be a head coach, whatever. But he was, at the time, he wasn't really interviewing with people. He wasn't even really connected to other jobs, so he was there, but he wasn't, downtown New Orleans, ladies and gentlemen, it's Gotham City. This is just unbelievable. But, so, yeah, it was a late developing thing as far as, like, the entire league.
As a matter of fact, I remember looking at those odds when Joe Brady announced he was staying in Buffalo. There were 7 candidates left on the list, and we were talking about Joe Brady and Mike McCarthy. Anthony Weaver had interviewed. We were talking about Mike Kafka. Kellen Moore was 6th out of the 7 on the list as far as odds. And then they went and hung 55 on the Commanders in the NFC Championship game. Boom. Stock skyrockets. Saints interview him the next day. That's the path they're heading. The last 2 weeks have been a whirlwind. They hang 40 on the Chiefs in the Super Bowl, and all of a sudden you feel much better. And you look at Philly this year, 8th in the NFL in total offense, 7th in the NFL in scoring offense, 2nd in the NFL in rushing offense, 29th in passing offense. And that's a passing offense that had A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert. You were 29th in the NFL in passing offense.
So I had a feeling, and if you've been watching this channel for a long time, you understand what I'm about to say here. I had a feeling the 29th was passing yards per game. Passing yards per game does not equate to passing offense, okay? You have to factor in game state. You have to factor in all kind of things when you go into statistics. And when you look at yards per game or yards per game allowed or things like that, it can get skewed because of the game state. If Philadelphia is up 35-0 in the third quarter, they're not going to pass. So it's going to drive down their passing yards per game, right? So you have to go to different stats. You cannot just go to ESPN.com, sort by yards per game, and expect that that's how it all plays out. So you go to DVOA. If you go to DVOA, which weights this kind of stuff out and it grades things on a per average or a per play basis versus the average, it takes some of that guesswork out. Philadelphia is 14th in passing offense. All right, so the 29th is not right. That is incorrect.
Only 3 teams were worse at throwing the football.
It's just such a bad way. I cannot believe in 2025 we're talking about this, but I mean, it has to make let me know in the comments if this makes sense. But to equate passing yards per game with how good or bad you are passing the football is insane. If you have 0 yards passing in the fourth quarter because you're up 35-0, does that make you a bad passing offense? No, obviously not. What would make you a bad or good passing offense is if you are above or below average per play at throwing the football, right? So we got to get away. We got to get away from the ESPN stats and just the shallow stats. Football and sports is too advanced now. We cannot be using that as any kind of a barometer.
With all those weapons. Now, a big part of that is because you had a 2,000-yard rusher. But the Eagles this year won with defense and running the football. And I got news for you, Coach. Saquon Barkley ain't coming to New Orleans with Kellen Moore. So they're going to have to do it differently in New Orleans than they did this year in Philadelphia.
Yeah, so ESPN showed a stat where since Kellen Moore has been an offensive coordinator, so this blends Dallas, the Chargers, and Philadelphia, it showed his quarterback rating on average, his points per game on average, and I think his maybe yards per game on average. But he was 5th in, I think, all 3. Top 5. Okay? So no one's asking him to turn Alvin Kamara into a 2,000-yard running back. No one's asking the Saints to be a copy of Philadelphia. Out of all of his spots, he has spent the least amount of time in Philadelphia, tied with the Chargers. All right? So the idea that, he's just going to run the football and it'd be defense. No. It will be a blend of what he did in Dallas and what he did in Philadelphia. And what we know he can do is adapt to what is on the roster and what the game needs. I saw it in the Super Bowl. Saquon Barkley, 20-something carries, 50 yards. Didn't matter. Find a way to win. Find a way to utilize the weapons he's got, mismatches, whatever, get people open, and people were sure as hell open against Spags' defense. Steve, like I know him on a personal basis. Oh, Steve's defense. So I think that's a bit of a... I don't think that's appropriate to believe like the only way Kellen can do it is with Saquon Barkley and the Eagles defense.
But I'll tell you there's reasons why I like the hire.
Thank God.
From the moment the New Orleans Saints fired Dennis Allen, I sat here and said, my choice is a young, offensive-minded head coach. The NFL is a copycat league. Look at the trends. Go find a young, offensive-minded coach. My preference was off the McVay-Shanahan tree. You didn't get that exactly, but you still got a guy at 36 years old.
Youngest coach in the NFL next year. So, again, young offensive, think about what we're talking about. What would you want? Let's pretend we can go all the way back to when Dennis Allen's fired. You can build your coach. You can build a coach. Okay? I should be out in the Lakeside Mall with my little pop-up store. Build a coach. You would have offensive. You would have play caller. You'd have experience. You'd have young. You'd have success. All that stuff. Kellen Moore is maxed out on all of those. Young, 36, the youngest head coach in the NFL. Okay, max that one out. You've got the youngest guy. Experience. 2019, he was an offensive coordinator. That's a long time. Okay, max it out. Success. Just won the Super Bowl. It don't get much more successful than that. Max it out. So, Matt's telling you right there, what he wants in a coach or whatever, Kellen Moore has in spades. Kellen Moore has, and then some. If you combined Ben Johnson and Joe Brady, they wouldn't have the experience or the success of Kellen Moore. All right? So whether it's luck or the Saints have backed into it or whatever, the fact of the matter is that moving forward, you couldn't ask for a better candidate than Kellen Moore, which is why I think if you re-ranked everybody, he would jump way ahead of Liam Cohen and way ahead of Joe Brady and way ahead of Ben Johnson,
who's the youngest head coach in the NFL now, who, of course, is offensive-minded. Was a great college quarterback at Boise State. We know he won 50. He was 50-3 during his time as the quarterback at Boise State.
Let me roll this back, too. I just had another thought. So when you talk about, Kellen, he has Saquon Barkley in that defense, and that he's not going to have that. Is that what they would say about Joe Brady? Would they say, well, Joe Brady's not going to have Josh Allen and that running game and that defense? He's not going to have that in New Orleans, so be prepared. Be prepared. Would they say, well, Ben Johnson's not going to have, he's not going to have that offensive line. He's not going to have that defensive line. He's not going to have those playmakers, so, be prepared. Any coordinator coming off of one of the best teams in the NFL and going to a team that fired their coach, that's going to be the low-hanging fruit. Yeah, obviously the rosters aren't as good. Obviously, right? So even that narrative also holds no water.
Came into the NFL, played parts of 7 seasons in the NFL, went right into coaching, Cowboys, Chargers, Eagles, and now the head coach of the New Orleans Saints. You look at the best coaches in the league, Andy Reid, Sean McVay, Kyle Shanahan, Nick Sirianni, who just won a Super Bowl, guys like Matt LaFleur, Jim Harbaugh, offensive-minded coaches. There are exceptions, Mike Tomlin, John Harbaugh, Dan Campbell. There's good coaches that aren't offensive-minded coaches, but you can see the trend where the NFL is going. And it's also interesting because...
Well, offensive also helps you because you don't have to worry about the turnover. Like Dan Campbell, great coach, right? But he's got to now figure out, okay, well, I got to find 2 coordinators to replace. John Harbaugh has to deal with that, right? Todd Bowles is a horrible head coach, but he's got to deal with the constant turnover of his offensive coordinator. So having an offensive head coach, you eliminate that turnover to where you're calling the same designs, you're designing the same system, the scheme, all that stuff's all the same. You're building off the same tree. Your players are familiar with it. They just get more familiar with it. So a huge benefit of having an offensive head coach, especially one that's 36 years old. If Kellen Moore, this is crazy to think about, if Kellen Moore coaches for 35 years as the Saints head coach, 35, he will be younger when he retires than Pete Carroll is right now. That is knuckin' futz.
Because he's been an offensive coordinator now at 3 different stops. Dallas, the Chargers, and the Eagles.
Yes.
He had Dak Prescott, Justin Herbert, Jalen Hurts. 3 very different quarterbacks in their skill sets, in their experience, in their styles, and they managed to get going with each of them.
And very different front offices, very different situations with the team. He was hired under Jason Garrett. Okay, so he has a domineering owner and / GM in Jerry Jones. Jason Garrett gets fired. They bring in Mike McCarthy. He retains play calling duties, all that stuff. Then he gets let go, goes to the Chargers, where Brandon Staley is under mega duress. Staley gets fired. He goes to Philadelphia, who is in the middle of a toxic situation where they just got dominated by the Buccaneers in the playoffs. Sirianni's on the hot seat. Jalen Hurts is on the hot seat. They lost 6 straight games in the season. Turns them around. So not only has he proved that he's adaptable with the roster, but adaptable with the type of players or the type of offense he wants to run, but he's also adaptable with that front office. And I can go ahead and tell you this. Gail Benson, much easier to work for than Jerry Jones. All right, so he has navigated any and all volatile situations you could possibly want him to navigate. And he's navigated them very, very well.
Now, there is also legitimate reason to question this. There's obviously the lack of experience.
Well, if you are going to if you're going to say that you're concerned about the lack of experience, you certainly cannot say that Ben Johnson or Joe Brady would have been better hires, because, as I've mentioned, he has much more experience than both of them. So now, if you believe that none of the young offensive coordinators would have been your pick because all of them are too young, then yeah, whatever. I mean, sure, no doubt about it. That is a totally reasonable thing to believe. Like, hey, I want my head coach to have way more experience or be older or whatever. Understandable. But you can't want the experience and simultaneously wish you got Joe Brady and / Ben Johnson.
Came into the NFL very young and has rapidly ascended. But as I just mentioned, we've seen young coaches have great success. During his time in Dallas, they were successful statistically. 4 seasons as the offensive coordinator. He was the play caller, by the way. It was not McCarthy. Moore was the play caller. In 2019, they were 6th in total offense.
Boy, do we know that. I was screaming from the rooftops that Mike McCarthy was not calling plays. What are we doing here?
Then they went to 17th. Then 1st, they led the NFL in total offense in 2021. And then in 2022, they were 3rd. So the lowest he finished was 17th. The other years were 1st, 3rd, and 6th. But last year, again, that was Mike McCarthy's offense, veteran quarterback in Dak. Goes to the Chargers for 1 season. They're 21st in the NFL.
Well, I'm not sure what he's talking about with Mike McCarthy's offense. I don't know if he was talking about after Moore left, or I don't get that part of the reference.
In total offense. That's with Justin Herbert. Boom.
Herbert was banged up.
Fired, and then he's off to Philly. Emmitt Smith, over the past 3 years, has been pretty vocal, Cowboys legend, about his lack of confidence or criticism, I should say, in Kellen Moore. Play number 2.
I have a sneaky feeling, if I know Emmitt, and I have a sneaky feeling that he probably wanted more of a running-based offense, that he probably thinks all the throwing is probably not the best way to go about it. He probably wants a little bit more of running on first down.
2, please. This was just a smidge of Emmitt Smith. I believe this was an interview with USA Today. Give a listen.
See, in our past, under Kellen, I think we was just calling damn plays just to be calling plays. I don't think we was building upon anything. There was nothing that established this that made sense to play off of that and then go to here and here. It was just play calling, and every now and then we're going to throw in a little trick play, and the trick play would work sometime, then and sometime it won't. It'd be a wasted play and all that kind of stuff. Losing momentum, gaining momentum, it was just too much.
That's Emmitt Smith. That ain't me saying it. That's Emmitt Smith saying it. You're going to hear the counter to that as well. And clearly, they're pretty good offensively this year in Philadelphia. But ultimately, the sample size will grow, and we'll make that determination about his success or failures. But for Kellen,
I will say, too, like he is a different play caller now than he was in Dallas. I mean, we're not getting the Dallas Kellen Moore. We're getting a very different version of Kellen Moore. We're getting a Kellen Moore that's been around a little bit more, seen a little more, tried some new stuff, learned some new things, won a Super Bowl. So, even the criticism in Dallas, which I'm sure is fine, you're getting a different version of Kellen.
Kellen Moore, there's 2 really important decisions from jump he's got to make. Number 1 is his defensive coordinator.
Yeah.
Because
hopefully it's Brandon Staley.
We have just seen this not only in New Orleans, but across the NFL. If you're a head coach that specializes on one side of the ball, you got to nail it on the other side of the ball.
Yeah, Sean Payton was the king of this. When Sean Payton had bad DCs, shout out Spags, the Saints were horrible. Even with Sean Payton and Drew Brees in his prime Drew Brees got you 3 straight 7-9 seasons because your defense was the worst in the NFL. It wasn't until they fixed the defense that the Saints started winning. So no doubt about it, Kellen can be the best offensive guy we got, but you got to nail the defense. Good news is Brandon Staley, last time he was a DC, was rocking and rolling with the number 1 rated defense in the Chargers. So is Brandon Staley a good head coach? No. But he has been successful as a DC. You're also getting, again, young, innovative, outside voice, new ideas. I like it.
The ball. Look at Dennis Allen. He retains Pete Carmichael. The defense in New Orleans under Allen, the first year, was still good.
Yeah.
The offense was not.
No, it was
We
not.
talk about injuries, but the reality is what it is. Your record, you are what your record says you are. Go back to Sean Payton. When Sean Payton was rolling offensively, great. What did it look like when Steve Spagnuolo and Rob Ryan were the defensive coordinators? You were a sub-500 team
7-9.
Sean Payton and Drew Brees. You got to nail the other side of the ball.
No doubt.
A lot of the scuttlebutt is that Brandon Staley, who was the head coach with the Chargers, who hired Moore in Los Angeles, could be the front runner for that job. We'll see, but you got to nail that hire.
Yeah.
The other is, what do you do with Derek Carr? Did the Saints get...
Another thing about Brandon Staley is that I think it is good if you can have some former head coach experience there to help Kellen navigate some of the new stuff that he'll encounter being a head coach. And even though Brandon Staley wasn't successful as a head coach, he can still offer a little bit of like, oh, you can expect this. Oh, this is how this works. Oh, this is how team meetings and the NFL meetings or whatever, this is how this happens. So just having that wrinkle too is a bonus for having Brandon Staley on the staff.
Kellen Moore, and in so doing, promising him that Derek Carr will be back so you have a better chance of success in year one?
I would assume the Carr conversation's already happened. I think Kellen, I know it's already happened. You don't take the job and have a question mark about what you're going to do at quarterback. So he's either told Loomis, I want to see what I can do with Derek Carr. I want to have an established veteran quarterback in there. Or he's told Loomis, I'm cool moving forward with Spencer Rattler or drafting a quarterback or whatever. But I can go ahead and tell you, whatever the decision is with Derek Carr is based on what Kellen Moore wants. So, and if Kellen keeps Derek Carr and Derek Carr is quarterback next year, fine. I don't care. I'll put the call with Kellen. I'll trust him to make that decision. If it was me, I'd release him, but I'm not the head coach. So one way or the other, doesn't matter. If it makes Kellen more successful, it makes the Saints more successful. If it, long-term benefit, cool with me. Totally fine with that. But there's no doubt in my mind that conversation was had, agreed upon, and they already know what they're going to do. And I also have mentioned this a few times, I don't think it's a coincidence that Derek Carr was gone during Super Bowl week in New Orleans. Biggest week in the city that you could ever imagine. Every news station, every TV station, every celebrity, whatever, is down here. Radio Row, media week, all of that. Interviews all over the shop. And the franchise quarterback of the pro team that's here is not here, is in Fresno. I did more Radio Row than Derek Carr did. That says quite a bit, I think. I think the writing is on the wall. If Derek Carr was going to be the starting quarterback or the franchise quarterback next year of this team, I think he would have been in the city. We saw Cam Jordan, Demario Davis, Spencer Rattler, Sean Payton, Drew Brees. I think every single New Orleans Saint did an interview with New Orleans.football during Radio Row. I saw Rashid Shaheed was down there. So Bob Means was doing Radio Row spots. The fact that Carr wasn't there, again, I don't think it's a coincidence.
Did they promise patience, saying, look, we're going to move on from Derek Carr, but we're going to give you patience to build this thing the right way with the guy you want under center? I don't know the answer to that. We'll learn in time. But those are the two biggest questions Kellen Moore's got to answer first. Who's your DC, and what are you going to do with Derek Carr? You get those answers, we'll have a much better idea of what New Orleans is going to be. But the bottom line is, it does not matter. It does not matter how good of a coach Kellen Moore is, or anybody, if you don't have roster and culture. Look at New England. Bill Belichick is the greatest coach in the history of football. The man won 6 Super Bowls as a head coach. When Tom Brady left, they went 7-9, 10-7, 8-9, 4-13. He's fired. You can literally be the greatest coach of all time, but when you don't have players and culture, you cannot win. So, will Mickey Loomis get out of the way and get this roster younger and more talented?
That is the next step. This was the first domino to fall. The next domino falls in April. That domino is named the 9th overall pick. It is now up to Mickey Loomis in the front office to do what they did in 2016 and 2017. And if they can nail the draft classes and get this team younger, it is going to be younger regardless, because most of our older players are either about to retire or be released or traded or cut, or however you want to phrase it, in the next 2 years. I think in 2027, the Saints will have the youngest roster in the NFL. That's a prediction for me. Go ahead and screenshot it, write it down, whatever. Saints are headed towards one of the youngest rosters in the NFL. They're headed towards one of the best cap situations in the NFL. As of right now, $220 million under the cap in 2027. That will not be the official number. Of course, that'll be moved around a little bit. Let's just call it $70 million under the cap, whatever. Still have a ton of cap room in 2027 with a young roster. The big question is, will it be a young, talented roster? There's a big difference between being young and then being young and talented. Okay? So it's up to the front office to do that. We don't know the answer to that now. We will see that throughout the next couple of months. We'll see it on draft day or draft weekend, and then we'll really see it in the regular season, where hopefully these draft picks are playing meaningful minutes, they're getting meaningful reps, and they're impactful. And then we're in a situation where in 2027, boom, just like when Alvin Kamara and Michael Thomas and Mark Ingram and Marshawn Lattimore and Ryan Ramczyk and all these guys showed up, and next thing you know, the Saints had an incredible 5-year window, just like that. Or is that what's going to happen in the next couple of draft classes? We'll see. But now that the head coach, now that we got an A-plus head coach, now that they absolutely nailed, a little wolf pack for you, a little too sweet for you, now that they absolutely nailed the head coaching hire, okay, let's go to the draft.
That's the question. Bigger than anything else. Because I don't care if it's Kellen Moore, Bill Belichick, or anybody in between. If this roster doesn't get younger and more talented, nobody can win.
Yeah, true.
Because right now, all you have is a bunch of bad debt from years of buying on credit. You have spent years swiping that credit card, kicking the bill down the road, and all you got to show for it is a bunch of veteran players with no rings that are past their prime that cost you way too much.
Wrong. All you have to show for it is 15 years of being a very good team and being relevant and a Super Bowl and some of the most successful, probably the most successful 2 decades a team could ever ask for. Okay? I've shown this a million times. Kevin Cole, unexpected points. Love this guy. Talks about how the Eagles didn't get to where they are through team building or draft picks or the trenches or whatever. They got there through financial alchemy. Okay? Pushing cost off into the future in extreme fashion to allow maximum talent on the field under the 2024 salary cap. Okay? Pushing cost out into the future can't last forever, but it works extremely well as long as players continue to perform. The downside to kicking the can only happens when players decline and you can't reasonably restructure and kick the can further. Who does that sound like? All right, the Eagles are taking further than anyone else the idea that a dollar's worth of player value today is worth more than tomorrow when the salary cap increases. Who does that sound like? The strategy of can kicking works really well if you have a core of younger talent by allowing you to retain them through the rookie deals and their primes on second contracts. The strategy fundamentally sets up windows of 4 to 6 years after hitting on picks and free agents. The downside to kicking the can only happens when players decline and you can't reasonably restructure and kick the can any further. It is very easy to sit here now and say that the Saints can kicking or whatever is the wrong way to manage a roster, and that it's the wrong way to go about roster building, and that you cannot succeed like that. Ladies and gentlemen, wrong. That is how you succeed. But what Kevin said of it works until, 2 things he said was you can't kick the can down any further because the players are either declining, there's nothing to kick, or there is no can, a.k.a. those players retire or are off your books. The Saints are hitting both of those. They hit where at the same time, all of the players who they were kicking down the road, they all got worse. Ryan Ramczyk has to medically retire. Cam Jordan got much worse. Demario Davis goes from being an all-pro to being middle of the pack. Okay? Drew Brees retires. Michael Thomas gets hurt. Basically has to medically retire. It happens. All right? Mark Ingram retired. We can go down the list. That's just where the Saints are. But the Eagles show you that is absolutely a way to win. It's easy to look at it after a 5-win season and say, this is a mistake, this is a disaster. But in other circles of the NFL, working pretty well. Okay? So I know it's easy to look at that and kind of have a negative light, but just remember that is the way to win, because $1 today is way more expensive than $1 in 5-10 years when the salary cap keeps growing. So yeah, pushing off cost and payments later on is absolutely the appropriate thing to do. You just have to be able to manage it and juggle it. And like Kevin said, you also need a plethora of young players. And you get that through the draft, a la 2016, 2017. Like Kevin said, that creates a 4 to 6 year window. 2016, 2017, what did that create? A 5-year window. Okay? It's right there in front of you. And guess what we have? 9th overall pick. This lined up perfectly. For all the negativity, for all the doom and gloom, for all the whatever, this lined up absolutely perfectly. We are reaching the downslope of our aging roster, where we're going to lose a lot of the aging players, a lot of the bad contracts. Simultaneously, we get the youngest coach in the NFL. Simultaneously, we have a 9th overall pick trying to rebuild through the draft. Now, the question is, can you nail the draft picks? There it is. But everything else is lining up perfect.
So what's it going to be, Mick? Are you actually going to give your young head coach a chance, or are you going to allow that mountain of debt to hang around his neck like an albatross destined to drag him to the bottom of the ocean?
No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Within the next 2 years, the debt's gone. We've already talked about it a million times. 2026, $60 million under the cap. 2027, $220 million under the cap. Massage those numbers out a little bit. All the stuff that we're saying, will it happen? Can it happen? How do you do it? Whatever, it's happening. We are getting rid of the debt. We are getting rid of the aging players. It's already happening. Quit talking about it. It's already in front of you. It's already taken place.
We'll find out in short order.
Let me tell you this. In review, if you do not like this hire, get in your car, drive down the street, go to Walmart, or Target, or Bromart, or wherever you want to go, park the car, walk inside, ask someone working, say, excuse me, where do y'all sell the diapers? Because you have a giant dump in your pants. There is nothing to be negative about this hire. The Saints knocked it out of the park. Fantastic stuff. 36-year-old, youngest coach in the NFL, offensive-minded Super Bowl champion, all that stuff. We're in the right direction with the cap. We're in the right direction with the aging roster. We're in the right direction with the draft. 9th overall pick. We're heading straight to April. It is a good day to be a Saints fan. And if you're not seeing that, you might want to find a different hobby. And you might want to find a therapist. Because if you can't be happy about this, you probably got some bigger problems going on. Okay? So, what a week. What a season. The Super Bowl has been over for not even 48 hours. And business has already picked up. This is going to be one hell of an off season. And I'm going to be there every step of the way. The season's over. I'm seeing a lot of people go on vacation. I'm seeing a lot of people go on ski trips and go to Florida or go to California. We're rocking and rolling every day. So, good stuff. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.